Hi everybody, my name's Rachel Garnham and I'd like to welcome everyone to this event discussing imperialism in the Middle East, NATO and the rearmament of Europe. Why does Starmer back Trump and Netanyahu's war drive? Today's forum is organised by Arise, a festival of left ideas, Britain's biggest left events platform online, and increasingly organising some brilliant in-person events too. This is a particularly timely discussion, both in light of the latest Israeli government aggressions and atrocities we have seen against the Palestinian people in recent days, and with the deliberate starving of Gaza continuing, and at the same time, the process we are seeing of the remilitarization of Europe, and including through the ever increasing levels of military spending here, which are accelerating exponentially. And ultimately, all of this is at the behest of Trump and the US empire. For many of us active in both anti-war movements and in our incredible movements in solidarity with the Palestinian people over the years and decades, it is further confirmation of our need to stand firmly for peace and justice. My first CND demos were as a child in the 1980s. I'm sure for many of you watching, your first demos were the same. And here in Britain, it feels like we have a harder job than ever under Starmer's government, and its militaristic war drive and its obsession with military spending, when we know that money can be better spent on public services and international aid. So to discuss these really important and timely issues, we're joined today by Steve Howell, Jenny Clegg and Marga Ferré. I'll introduce them separately as they come to speak to you. But just to say, we want to have as many questions and comments from the audience as possible. Because of the size of the audience, with hundreds of you joining us, we've volunteers who are going to be facilitating your questions and comments through the Q&A function in Zoom. So please do post both your comments for discussion and your questions to speakers in the Q&A function, because we will have hopefully plenty of time to answer your questions. It's a big topic and we want to be able to address the areas that you think are most important to discuss and to answer your questions. So if you can, please also do donate at the link provided. Each one of these events does cost hundreds of pounds, so please do donate today, because Arise is doing such a great job in sort of providing education and knowledge that we can't get anywhere else quite often. So and I would also say it's really great to hear where you're tuning in from. When we've done these events before, it's a truly global event and from all sort of corners of Britain as well. So do say hello in the Q&A and we will try and give some shout outs as well as answering your questions. Without further ado, I'd like to move to our first speaker, who's Steve Howell. Steve will be well known to many of you who have attended Arise and Labour Outlook events previously. He's an analyst of US and British politics, a long-time anti-imperialist campaigner who blogs regularly at The Rest is Bullshit on Substack, and one of my favourite people on social media as well. He's also the author of the novel Collateral Damage and the book Game Changer, written with reference to his previous role as a former advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, and looking forward to his new book coming out in the new year, Cold War Puerto Rico, which it'll be great to hear some more about as well. So I'm going to hand over to Steve now. Welcome, Steve. Thanks for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, it's a good question. Why is Starmer backing Netanyahu and Trump's drive to war? Why is he backing? Why is a Labour Prime Minister doing that? And indeed, why have so many Labour Prime Ministers basically bowed to Washington and followed Washington really from Attlee onwards? But we'll come back to that in a moment. It's been pretty difficult these past few months sometimes to make sense of Donald Trump flailing around as he has been, chaotically, seemingly erratically, on things like tariffs, threatening to annex Greenland and Canada, in relation to Iran, 1 minute talking about a regime change war, and the next minute a fairly limited by US standards airstrike that probably didn't do as much damage as he claimed. Now, I think there is an inner logic to this, which quite a number of people have commented on, which is explicit in the statements made by, for example, Marco Rubio when he was the US Secretary of State, when he was approved by Congress, and outlined how it was necessary for the United States to adapt to new realities. And he said he said that at the end of the Cold War there was a sense of triumphalism. That was his word. Which he said led to the dangerous delusion, again his words, that US hegemony was here to stay, with all the nations of the earth being subject to the West's rules-based order, which of course in reality meant subject to the rules made by the ruler, which was Washington. So he's quite explicit about that. If you look back to the end of the Cold War and the 1990s, and the early 2000s, it did seem as if everything was going smoothly for US hegemony. US companies could outsource their production anywhere to get the cheapest labor. They were safe in doing that, in the knowledge that the hegemon could step in and protect their assets. And the US began to work its way through a shopping list of countries whose regimes it was going to change, starting with Yugoslavia and moving on to Iraq and Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. You don't need me to spell out all the details. The trouble was that what Rubio called the religious commitment to free and unfettered trade came at the expense of the US's own industrial base. And the costs of these forever wars began to become unsustainable. These wars were not the pushover that America thought they were going to be. And in the course of all that, countries like China and India and other nations in the global south began to turn the tables on the United States economically. The exploitation of their economies that globalization was designed for ended up helping them to rapidly advance their own economies. Rubio himself was once all in favor of globalization, but he now says a unipolar world was an anomaly. And he says the US has to accept a multipolar world with multi-great powers in different parts of the planet, sketching out perhaps that the US wants certain spheres of influence rather than trying to be the overall global superpower. So in this context, I don't think Trumpism is as crazy as it appears, although the personality of the man and his inconsistencies and outbursts give it that element of craziness. But underpinning it is something that is rational and is an attempt to adjust to new realities, a re-engineering, if you like, of the US empire to halt or at least slow its decline. This doesn't mean that US imperialism is any less dangerous, despite Trump's protestations that he's not going to start any wars. The trouble is that there's a contradiction between America first and making America great. America first, the essence of it is isolationist. But the reality is that most US corporations make huge profits from assets spread across the world. The export of capital, as opposed to the export of goods, has for more than a century been a defining feature of imperialist economies, of what we now call the G7 countries. According to the International Monetary Fund, the overall stock of foreign direct investment increased from less than 10% of global GDP in the 1970s and 1980s to reach 60% by 2015, with nearly all of it emanating from the major capitalist countries, the G7 countries. By 2022-23, the US itself had accumulated direct foreign investments worth nearly $7 trillion. And these assets need to be protected and continually enhanced. in the interests of US corporations by, for example, grabbing rare earth minerals that are in abundance in, for example, Greenland and Ukraine. So you've got this contradiction between the base of Trumpism, which is America first and wanting to be isolationist, and on the other hand, those who have bankrolled Trump, the big corporations and the billionaires who have global interests. And the issue for Trump and those around him, therefore, is how to advance US global interests while keeping his isolationist base on side and without overstretching the very overstretched US military and the very overstretched, heavily indebted US economy. So he's got to prioritize, and the indications are that the priority is to contain, maybe ultimately provoke a proxy war with China, whilst trying to neutralize Russia and take them out of the game. So far, that's not going so well, but that's another story and not so much for this discussion, I think. And of course, he's happy to back Israel to the hilt as his main Middle East gendarme, but he wants to do it without the US getting directly embroiled itself in the region in the way that it did with Iraq and with Afghanistan. And alongside that, he's pressurized the European NATO countries to ramp up military spending so that they can fight their own wars or be more useful in helping the United States in any he does decide to fight himself. So how does Starmer fit in? Well, in essence, Starmer is desperately trying to remain what Britain has been since at least the 1960s, which is America's little helper, and you could argue actually more like the 1940s in the post-war settlement. And that's clear from the Strategic Defence Review published in June. It was presented to the public in the media as a response to a Russian threat, with a lot of scaremongering about that. In this weekend in the Times, former Tory MP Bob Seeley even claimed that Russia could overwhelm what he called NATO's modest forces, which once you actually dig into the facts, and I put something on my Substack about this with the detailed figures, but I won't quote them now. But military spending of the European NATO members is 3 times as much as Russia's, even after Russia's increased its spending considerably as a result of the war in Ukraine. And that European NATO member spending is over and above the spending by Ukraine and the support for Ukraine by the NATO countries and including the United States. And that's before the massive rearmament at the behest of Trump, which will more than double the UK's military spending. So the idea that NATO could be overwhelmed by Russia when Russia is bogged down in a war of attrition, it can't even overwhelm Ukraine, is in my view preposterous. But when you read that defence review, deeper in it, you find the section on strategic context. And there's no mention of a Russian invasion of Europe. Instead, we're told the problem is growing multipolarity and intensifying strategic competition from states who are seeking, this is a quote, to reshape the rules-based international order that has governed international relations since the Second World War. As ever, the rules-based order is being used here to mean the rules of the West, not international law, as understood by the rest of the world. And if that was in any doubt, the subsequent sentence, a subsequent sentence confirms the review's meaning by saying, intensifying, this is a quote, intensifying strategic competition will make it more difficult for the UK and its allies to shape the world and events in their interests. In other words, it's very much about Britain's role in the Strategic Defence Review is very much about Britain's role in asserting Western power in these new circumstances of intensifying strategic competition. And as one of the authors of the review, Fiona Hill, has literally said, that means selling the UK to Washington as, and these were her words, an aircraft carrier all of itself. And she went on to highlight the fact that the overseas capabilities of the UK, something like 81 countries in which we have defence personnel based and military assets based, that could bolster the capabilities of its allies and partners in other theatres of importance to the UK. And that's a quote as well. And wait for it, notably the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. So not the European theatre, not defending ourselves against Russia, but the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific are specifically named by Fiona Hill as being where Britain can help the United States.
If you
So
think about finishing up shortly.
A couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. So Starmer is essentially continuing the same policy that we've seen from other British governments, which is to be the US aircraft carrier and to be the ally to the US in any wars that they choose to fight, any interventions they choose to make. And I want to finish on this point. I think it's time for us to open up a discussion about NATO, which is long overdue. In 1985, Tony Benn said at a meeting that I helped to organise in Sheffield, and this speech was published, NATO membership effectively freezes out Britain having an independent foreign policy. He called for a public debate on NATO with a view to Labour adopting a policy of withdrawing. Bafflingly, 40 years later, some on the left still can't see beyond being part of the NATO alliance. The Green Party, for example, and this is a quote, recognises that NATO has an important role in ensuring the ability of its member states to respond to threats to their security. So, it's, in my opinion, pretty depressing to see the Green Party saying that. The case against NATO was strong in Benn's day. It's surely even stronger now after NATO's invasion of Afghanistan, its bombing of Libya, and the complicity of NATO countries in Israel's genocide. Why would you want to be part of a club that is arming a genocide? And I think across the political spectrum, across the left spectrum, should I say, we now need to be saying to people, look, this multipolar world is an opportunity for us to open up a debate about having an independent foreign policy, about creating a different kind of coalition of the willing, a coalition for peace, a coalition to rebuild the United Nations, about strengthening and enforcing international law, about working with the global South, about rebuilding institutions that help to keep this peace during the Cold War. Starmer's plan to increase UK military spending from 66 billion to 143 billion annually is obscene. It will create a black hole 15 times the size of the one supposedly created by not going ahead with the disability benefit cuts. A break with NATO is really long overdue.
Thank you so much, Steve. And couldn't agree more that we need to rehabilitate a campaign against NATO, because it's something not enough people are talking about. So I'm glad we're talking about it tonight. I'm going to hand over to Ben Lau, who's an Arise volunteer, who's going to tell us a bit more about today's organisers and what you can do to support. So welcome, Ben. Over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for coming to this event by Arise. Why does Starmer back Trump and Netanyahu's war drive? As you've just heard from Steve and seen all over the news, the drive to war is intensifying. We seem to be finding unlimited amounts of money for defence spending, while cuts are being made to continue the austerity that we've been living under for far too long already. So in these difficult times, it is all the more important that organisations like Arise exist. Arise gives a crucial platform to socialist ideas, activists, left MPs, trade unionists, and much, much more. But Putting on great events like this isn't free, so please consider contributing to growing our movement by becoming a friend of Arise and making a regular donation, or even just making a one-off donation to help cover the cost of this event. Any and all contributions are appreciated. And on that note, I'll hand back over to Rachel.
Thanks, Ben. Really important, the work that Arise is doing, with so much going on in the world and in Britain as well. Our next speaker is Jenny Clegg. Jenny is author of the book China's Global Strategy Towards a Multipolar World, and active with peace campaigns such as the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and the Stop the War Coalition. She's a senior lecturer in international studies at the University of Central Lancashire, and we're delighted to have her here with us this evening. So over to you, Jenny.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'm really delighted to be invited to join this panel. I would say I'm a former lecturer at UCLan. You know, with the world in such terrible disarray, how are we to make some sense of what's going on? Like Steve, my approach is going to look at the bigger picture and quite possibly cover quite a lot of the ground that he has covered, but perhaps filling in the jigsaw with some different bits of information, and also perhaps taking a different approach in the argument. But I think that it's important to look back, to start by looking back to just after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Wolfowitz developed the argument that the main task of the US superpower was to prevent the rise of any potential competitors. Then after 9/11, Bush, channeling Wolfowitz, seized the multipolar moment, vowing to deal with 7 countries in 5 years, and I will list them: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. The problem now for the United States is that they're still working through the list, whilst the main competitor, that is China, now with a GDP 2/3 the size of the US, has become the world's biggest in trade, in manufacturing, and is advancing along the technological frontiers. With China catching up, Biden set out an Indo-Pacific strategy, drawing the UK and the Australian allies into AUKUS, and Japan and Australia and India into the Quad. In addition, his national security strategy was to pinpoint the dangers of Chinese competition in the areas of AI, quantum computing, space and cyberspace in particular, threatening US future military dominance. The Ukraine war was then made a moral crusade to unite democracies against autocracies, cementing a new Cold War division. At the NATO summit last year, China was cast as the decisive enabler of Russia's war, with Iran and North Korea also mentioned. This deadly quartet notion aims to underpin the demands for a global NATO by establishing the link between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. Biden, of course, has failed spectacularly. Support for the genocide in Gaza exposed the hypocrisy of Western values, shattering the moral authority on which the US claim to world leadership has rested since the end of World War II. The US now can only resort to coercion. And so Trump erupted onto the world stage in a wave of shock and awe, doubling down on a trade war targeted not just at China, but at everybody, and terrifying Europe with hints of abandoning them in the face of threats from Russia and a chaotic Middle East. In doing so, he has been able to extort huge sums of military spending. Now, Trump, it's said, wants the Europeans to cover the cost of defending Europe so he can finally pivot to China. Yet the US still needs to control the Middle East. In part, this is about keeping leverage over China, which imports roughly half of its crude oil from the Gulf. But there's also the fact that Gulf states reinvest their dollar revenues earned from oil in the US, so offsetting US debt and strengthening the dollar. The possibility of using the renminbi in Middle East-China trade could be a major threat to US dollar hegemony. Now, to return to this deadly quartet idea of the US hawks, which is now being echoed both by Rutte and Starmer. What this is really about is establishing a complete system of military control over Eurasia, from Russia to the Middle East to China and Northeast Asia. This military system is to be based on those technologies I've mentioned. What today's wars show us is how what happens on the battleground is controlled from space using cyber and AI technologies, the surveillance, the targeting, the shooting down of incoming missiles. The huge military budgets are now going to grow a globalized military industrial complex centered on US core technologies. Trump's tariffs have a role here, not simply to constrain, but to isolate China, forcing its trading partners not only to decouple, but locking them instead in a US world system with deals tied where possible into arms and security-based supply chains. We're already seeing how the globalized production of F-35s works, how this has tied up our foreign policy options. Well, this is the direction that the US global militarization is taking. So, as Steve said, much more is going on here than the Ukraine war. And I was going to mention how Russia's military spend is still only 1/3 of the existing EU total. The military budgets of the UK, France, and Germany alone are 1.5 times greater than Russia's. The US, no doubt banking on monies saved from Europe, plans an $800 billion Golden Dome project modeled on Israel's Iron Dome. This protective shield supposedly would allow the US to launch a missile or even nuclear attack on China without fear of retaliation, except the Iron Dome doesn't work properly for Israel, just slightly bigger than Wales, let alone a territory the size of the US. Here in the UK, we're increasing the number of astute nuclear-powered submarines for AUKUS from 7 to 12. There's also the Tempest fighter jet, a joint project with Italy and Japan. Neither of these will be ready until early 2030s, too late for a Russian attack, which Rutte predicts within 5 years. And the government's own projects agency says it's unachievable. So cost and timescale overruns threaten to spiral out of control. And if they're anything like the F-35s, they'll only be operational for half the time. War is imminent, we're told, but it seems we're preparing for a forever war with Russia, burdening generations to come. Catastrophizing the future, Russia warns that China, in attempting to seize Taiwan, would urge Moscow to launch a parallel attack on NATO territory. Why does Starmer support all of this? And let's just note for a moment that our ally, Australia, has just said it will not spend more than 2% of its GDP on defence. But for the UK, it's all about the special relationship, enabling our nuclear weapons. In return, we offer the US services of our military bases around the world, the Akrotiri base, of course, playing a key role in the Gaza genocide. And we also provide a key link between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific with AUKUS. The point of being a nuclear weapons state is to retain our global status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. But the world is changing, becoming less Western, more multipolar. The influence of the BRICS is growing. Much of the global south is not buying into the militarization. 85% of the world did not support the sanctions on Russia over Ukraine. They see a world order failing their needs on climate change, on the debt burden, world health, failing on Gaza. They see how the US and Israel wield the rule of power, shredding any norms of warfare, their disrespect for the UN, their readiness to push the international order off a cliff. So much for peace through strength. For their own survival, many in the global south seek a new kind of world. The BRICS are wondering about another proposal, that France's permanent seat on the UN Security Council go to Africa and the UK seat goes to Latin America. Perhaps that goes some part of the way to explaining why Starmer backs Trump's agenda of world military dominance. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. I found that really encouraging as a contribution in these difficult times. So very, very welcome, an interesting perspective. before we move on to our final speaker, I just wanted to welcome everyone who's joined us. We've got well over 100 people just in this meeting, and I know people watching on streaming as well, from Stockport, Essex, West Yorkshire, people up in the Highlands and north of Scotland, Winchester, Thornbury, and all over really. Just wanted to draw attention to a couple of comments from the chat, well, from the Q&A, sorry, which says, Stephen says, 100% agree about NATO with Steve's point, forcing us to fund US aggression and imperialist wars. We need it out of NATO for the sake of people and peace in the world. And Jeffrey points out the complicity of the genocide of the complicity in the genocide of the EU leadership as well. So do welcome your comments as well as your questions. And before our last speaker, do have a think about what you'd like to ask. I've seen a couple of questions come in already, but yeah, we will have time for those. So just to move on to our final speaker, that's Marga Ferré. Marga is the president of Transform Europe and co-president of Fundación de Estudios, Críticos in Spain, and apologies for my accent, and over to you, Marga.
Yeah, please apology. I asked you apology for my English. It's terrible, but I hope I can make myself understandable for you. I'm Marga Ferré. I'm a Spaniard, and you can see by my accent. And I'm the president of Transform Europe. Transform Europe is a network of political foundations, center of studies of critical thinking, of 38 organizations of 23 countries in Europe. I'm saying this because the ideas I want to share with you have been debated in this network and goes in the same line like Steve and Jenny on the idea of what is behind this militarization, psychotic and hysterical narrative is growing in societies, in the media and in the political leaders, until the point that a labor leader is having a narrative that is not very different from the far-right leaders. One of the things I want to insist in this conversation is the contradiction for me in the UK today, which is that we got studies to demonstrate that the more a government accommodates itself to the narrative of the far right, the only they got is the far right being stronger. So why the Prime Minister of the UK is now having this narrative about migrants or copying literally the most military words saying by right-wing or conservatives, even far-right leaders in the world? I think it's a contradiction that drops out to something that Jenny and Steve has said before. What we found, of course, is a capitalist analysis of how capitalism in the US is working. But here in Europe, we must understand that the way our governments are following Donald Trump's path has some components of racism and the melancholy of the lost empire. For them, being European is being a civilized person, having something like the Britannia rules, but European rules the world. As we don't rules anymore, it's not we, of course, it's a class question. They feel really that they must follow a racist understandable of how the world works. Let me quote for you a sentence of the Minister of Defense of Italy, who you know is governed by the far-right political party. He said, and I quote, "NATO knows how to talk to the global south." This is racism, pure and simple racism. It's a way like these white men elites reacting to a world they don't understand anymore. Because Jenny and Steve are absolutely right. The world today is already multipolar, diverse, vibrant. We all know that the GDP of the BRICS are bigger than the GDP of the G7. Today, it's bigger and growing. So this displacement of the new world order creates some kind of racist and stupidity, I must say, in part of our leaders. Why I said this? Because when I went to The Hague in Netherlands to the anti-NATO demonstration, and the conversation with all the pacifist movement there were such a embarrassment we felt as Europeans to see our leaders treating Donald Trump as if Donald Trump was the king. I mean, they were one sec to kiss his hand. Mark Rutte, the NATO General Assembly, was so embarrassed talking to Donald Trump as if we are a protectorate that we feel embarrassed. I honestly think we don't deserve this, at least don't anymore. And I think conversation like this one we're having today is going around all around Europe and thinking something must change because this craziness must stop. Let me insist in something we need to argue with everybody. The 5% of the GDP for military spending is irrational, not only immoral. There is no economic or military basis for linking security to a percentage of the GDP. And it's so obvious that there is no relationship between the security of the population and the amount of money you put in the military industry that it's difficult to hide that the fact that the real intention is to force the European governments, including the UK, to force our taxes, mostly paid by the working people, to finance the US military industry. So I honestly think that we need to ask that if we want to protect the European social model or the social model in the UK, it is clear we need to stop this absurd realm. We have no economic basis, of course, no moral basis, but even no future or project for the future for our societies. And let me go then to think a rational question. The question is, as Jenny and Steve said, in Europe, at least the European Union, spend the 63% of the money buying weapons to the US military complex, only for the US companies. The 63% of our military budget goes to buy weapons to the US military industry. So the question is, okay, so who profits from this military spending? And I think it's rational to think, who are these companies and who are the owners of these companies? And let me insist on something you need to talk with everybody about. I mean, first, there is no need for more weapons in Europe, as clearly Steve said. Europe is the second largest military superpower in the world, by far. We don't need more weapons at all. That is for sure. But the problem is to understand that the military industry is so concentrated in few hands that there is only 5 US military companies who are the owners of almost the 80% of the market that we, the Europeans, buy. Who are they? They are 5 companies. The name is Lockheed Martin, Raytheon Technologies, Northern Group, Boeing, and General Dynamics. All of them, earn more than 400% in the stock market over the last 10 years. And all of them, and this is the most interesting thing I want to share with you today, all of them are owned by investment funds. All of them are, let me insist, owned by investment funds. Guess who? BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity, Street State, and I forgot one. Capital Group, sorry. These 5 investment funds are the owners of the 100% of the 5 biggest military companies in the US. We are buying the weapons with our money, the European working class. So when somebody in Europe said we need to stress the military industry from the European autonomy, or something like we need to put money in the European military industry, they are lying. They are lying. Even the leaders of the military industry in Europe said that, please don't give us so much money because we cannot manage it in the European industry. And also they are lying the workers and saying that they want to convert the factories into a military factory because that will benefit for the jobs and creating employment. That is not true at all, not true at all. And the most important is that these military factories are not creating future, because you can have a factory creating tanks, but how many tanks do you need? It's not forever. It's something limited. And also the tanks are not used, and I hope never used. It's something you put in a stock and never use it, like the majority of the weapons in the world. So it's completely useless. But let me insist that the idea, and I finish with this idea, for me it's obvious that what this elite who feel that they were born to rule the world or something like this. This racist elite we have, and also you have clearly in the UK, they are trying to impose austerity by military means. And that is what not only me, but so many people in Europe, we are opposing. And this conversation is so useful to stop this arms race that leads to a world economy. The only benefits are the elites and those who promote this kind of war narratives. So they want to make money from wars, to buy weapons and to kill more people, because let me insist that weapons are created only to kill human beings, that we see in the genocide in Gaza. So at least we can say not in our name and not with our money. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marga, and thank you for drawing attention to the sort of racist element of everything that's going on. We've got lots of questions now. Thank you very much. I think we'll have time for a couple of rounds, and what I'll do is I'll read out 3 questions and then ask the panel to sort of comment on, not necessarily answer all 3, because some of these are very detailed or very big questions, but to sort of make some commentary and response. So we'll do that twice around. So we're sort of done by 7:30 if we can be. So the first one is from Oliver. He says, hello from the Scottish Highlands. What, in your view, would a viable alternative to NATO look like, and how might we encourage other countries to leave the US sphere of influence and join us? So quite a big question there. Secondly, from Elaine, specifically for Jenny, but there's a sort of related question. So it says, could Jenny tell us more about how she sees China's role if they do play a bigger role with the BRICS? Is their agenda also imperialist or more benign? And related to that is question that says, the global South are playing a pivotal role in holding Israel to account, as shown by South Africa's genocide case. What role do they have to play in stopping Trump's push towards global war? And I'll come to the speakers in the same order, if that's okay. Steve, you're on mute at the moment. Just waiting for Ben to highlight you.
There we are. Sorry. I'll concentrate on that first question, I think. But can I just quickly come back on something that Marga said, not to disagree with her, but just to add, I think, something that's quite interesting. She highlighted the fact that the top 5 really big arms manufacturers are American companies and listed. And I happened to look this up the other day because of a piece I was writing. And of course, you're right. I'm not disagreeing. But it's interesting that the 6th, and not very far behind, is BAE, British BAE Systems. And I think, and it's the only European country on that list, company. So that I think that might, to some extent, help to explain why Starmer is positioning Britain in the way he is, because it is very much part of that picture you're describing, that BAE stands to gain massively from that. Its overall annual revenue is nearly $30 million, and the 5th placed US company is 30 point something million dollars. So it's not actually far behind those big American companies. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think yet again you have this picture of Britain being in this tucked in this relationship with the United States and seeing its interests as virtually synonymous with the US. And I think it's interesting that Fiona Hill, there were only 3 people on the Strategic Defence Review that Starmer set up, and one of them is a dual national, as I am, by the way, who lives in Washington and is based in Washington and was a Trump advisor. And she was one of 3 members of the UK Strategic Defence Review. On, I think it's Oliver's question, Oliver, I think I've got your name right. I think we need to get out of the idea that you need to be in a military alliance. I think that's the point. I mean, in the days of the Cold War, the peace movement used to say, you know, wanted to withdraw from NATO, but also the mutual dissolution of NATO and the Warsaw Pact and get away from military alliances. And actually, at the height of détente in the 1970s, when there was an improvement in relations between the Soviet Union and the East European countries and the West, there was a summit in Helsinki that the Conference for European Peace and Security in Helsinki, I think it was in 1974, I might be wrong on the date, but thereabouts, which set up an organization called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And at the end of the Cold War, I think there was an opportunity for that organization brought together every country in Europe, both West and East, in one organization designed to prevent war, improve relations. There was a lot of talk about confidence building and understanding and cooperation. And at the end of the Cold War, if the OSCE could have been given a chance to work and develop, but instead what we got was, you know, US hegemony and the expansion of NATO right up to Russia's borders, which obviously caused, well, increased tension, and we are where we are. So I think the point is that we need to, the alternative to NATO is not to create other military alliances. BRICS isn't a military alliance, it's an economic grouping. But the alternative is to strengthen institutions, multilateral institutions on a continental basis like the OSCE or on a global basis like the United Nations. And of course, there are going to be tensions and conflicts between countries. Well, I mean, hopefully, eventually there won't be, but in the foreseeable future. But there can be mechanisms by which there is kind of arbitration, if you like, a glorified global ACAS that kind of arbitrates on disputes and tries to resolve things without things going to war. And so I think that's the alternative to NATO. It's not another military alliance, if that's what your question was really asking.
Lovely. Thanks, Steve. I thought that was a more difficult question than you made it, so that's really useful. Thank you. I'm going to go to Jenny now. I think particularly about the role of China question.
Yes. I want to just start out by saying something about, imperialism, because it's often thought that, China is an imperialist power, the BRICS are imperialist powers. But I think that Marga gave a really very clear picture of imperialism in terms of the ways in which finance capital and industrial capital fuse together in a 21st century way. Lenin made those arguments a long time ago. I don't think that imperialism is about trade. I don't think that imperialism is about competition even. It's actually about monopoly. It's about actually how you stop your competitors, not compete with your competitors, but actually try and control the situation so that you undermine your competitors. And I think that that's the kind of argument that Wolfowitz was putting forward. I think that with the the problem with the world today is the inequality of power. When we look at Gaza, why can't this terrible situation stop? Where's the power? The power, is in the hands of Israel with the backing of the United States. So it's this underlying question that needs to be addressed. When we look at the BRICS, yes, there is a certain amount of that they want to enhance their regional power. They've got kind of two sides, but they're all large developing countries with very similar problems in an unequal world. They can't get their voice heard in the main world institutions, but they can help each other with their large markets, with their own industries, if they can find complementary ways to develop. I think as far as China is concerned, I think that it does show certain positive traits. First of all, in terms of what Steve was talking about, this idea of common security. It's really, what do we mean by security? Because by spending more and more on weapons and more sophisticated systems and more accurate nuclear weapons and all of this kind of stuff, I mean, that's just making Russia and China more and more nervous. And what are they going to do? They're going to, this is how the arms race starts. This is not about security. It's not about defense. It's about, trying to control other countries. And what we need to do is to, consider the aspects in the situation, the interests in a situation that are conflicting, and try and find ways to compromise. And the most important thing is to get stability so that countries can develop and deliver for their populations. I think that China is showing that it favors the approach of dialogue and negotiation. It brokered the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is promoting a degree of stability in the region, and at least limiting how much the US can interfere. It was also very helpful. China was very helpful in the recent conflict and tensions between India and Pakistan, and there are numerous other examples. China doesn't claim that it holds the whole picture of world civilization, as Marga was pointing out, the Europeans do, but it favors a dialogue between civilizations and people-to-people exchange. If you've not been to China, and you want to know more about it, I recommend going. So there's this whole question about what is security, and there's also this question about what priorities should you have. And of course, China's priorities now are in green development, and more countries, are looking to shift from neoliberal economic policies to more state-led sustainable development. And there was another part of the question which said, how do we persuade other countries to lessen their ties with the United States? And this is a very difficult problem for many countries because they're dependent on the dollar. They trade in the dollar, they earn in the dollar, they invest in the dollar. We need to find a way of establishing a different kind of multipolar currency system. But as far as the global south is concerned, they can see that the US-dominated world order is simply not working in their interests, and they're desperate, to find a different way of developing.
Thanks, Jenny. And finally, on this round of questions, then I think we'll squeeze one more in. Marga, do you want to add anything?
Yes, a couple of ideas. No, I think one of the questioners talk about we demand the welfare, not the warfare, and I think is the right answer. But let me insist in one thing. I see this violent reaction of those who think that they naturally own the world. It's also based in the idea of the monopolies that Jenny said. And I read, I think there is an article comparing what is happening today, even with the British Empire, with the imposition of monopolies. We must remember that the 5 biggest companies in the world today are 5 technological companies in the US, and the 5 of them are among the biggest private companies in capitalist history. I mean, it's not today. I mean, it's like forever. No? So when once the US vice president, if they got something like a vice president anyway, said that you Europeans not even dream in having your own artificial intelligence, it was this monopoly order that you cannot develop your own technology because you must buy our own technology. If that is not an imperialist imposition of a monopoly, I don't know what is it. And it's related about that. But these monopolies are breaking. The world is really much more vibrant, diverse. I mean, a lot of people in Europe, I mean, we are talking about these serious things, but in the ordinary people's life, it's much more natural to understand that the world is diverse and is different. There is no reaction against China as they would love to have, or people don't really believe that Russia is going to invade us tomorrow. I live in Spain. It's completely crazy to say in Spain that Russia is going to invade us. Completely irrational. So I don't know if this narrative is going to change or stop, because I don't know if it's going to work really. But meantime, they are going to harm and also to make some policies that really can harm the public services. Just a last remark in the question of NATO. Of course, NATO is completely useless, but not only NATO. I mean, all the military alliances, having the United Nations or having the European Union or having another kind of peace alliances, which is what we need for trade, for cultural, for solidarity, for cooperation. The military alliances are only a threatening organization of the US, so it's not needed anymore. But it's not a question of my personal opinion. I remember Nicolas Sarkozy, who was president of France 10 years ago, declaring that NATO was dead and completely useless. And was the president, conservative president of France. NATO was revitalized because of the Ukraine war. And one of the reasons, because the Ukraine war has not stopped yet, and unfortunately, is because of that. Nobody cares in Europe about having peace conversations, but again, talking about war, weapons, increasing our money to buy, our taxes also to buy weapons. There is only one other way to understand human security. And Steve was absolutely right. The Helsinki Act is something that I recommend to read. It was written 50 years ago, and all the principles there are pretty interesting for today. It follows the idea of all of Palme, the idea of the common security. If you're interested, I highly recommend you to go to the website of the International Peace Bureau, who are still defending this idea of common and shared security for human beings. But let me finish by this. I really prefer the human security definition by the United Nations. It says that human security means to be free of needs, and to be free of fear. And I think this is the class of society the majority of us wants. Thank you.
Thank you, Marga. Couldn't agree more. Before we wind up, I'm going to ask some more questions, which I'll then give to the panelists to give some views and some final comments, so that we don't keep you too long. And I would say these questions sort of aligned with, firstly, what can we do, and secondly, to bring us back to the title of the session, what's up with Starmer? How can we break this Labour government away from Trump, if at all possible? So firstly, from Alicia, she says she's working with some organisations to develop policies from the bottom up, using people, values and knowledge instead of neoliberal policies imposed by governments. Do you see these as a good way to go to break the impasse? So I think that's sort of, please tell us what some things we can do. And then from Hassan, I'd like to hear some more about why Starmer backs Netanyahu's war drive. Is it simply through Trump, or is there something we can say about Starmer more than that? So is there a world where Starmer could impose full sanctions on Israel given the immense pressure, or because of the US relationship? Is that something that will only be done with the US's blessing, and sort of related, again, what red line would need to be crossed if there is any to stop this government's support for Trump's foreign policy? And then finally, it's again, what can we do? How do we get our messaging across? Because there aren't enough voices of dissent against this massive increase in military spending. Steve quoted Tony Benn earlier. I'm going to quote him again because it sprang to mind. If we can find the money to kill people, we can find the money to help people. This is, as Marga said, this is what people want. But we're not getting enough traction really with that quite simple message. Before I go to our speakers, and I'd ask you to keep it to a couple of minutes if you can. I would like to thank everyone for taking part in this webinar, especially our speakers. If you can make a donation to keep Arise going and organising this type of useful session, please consider giving £5 a month to become a friend of Arise, or whatever you can afford. Our next online event is on the 7th of September with economist Michael Roberts launching an very exciting Marx Matters series, and that first event is entitled Capitalism Can't Save Us, How Marx's Economics Explains Today's Crisis, which again highly relevant, and so I think will be really useful for all of us. If you're able to be in Brighton at TUC conference, Arise will be co-hosting public events on alternative economic policies with John McDonnell, our annual socialist rally with a range of trade union broad left groups, and an event on Latin America's struggle against Trump. And during the Labour Party conference, we're excited to have an expanded Solidarity Hub from Saturday to Monday in Liverpool, featuring a show of solidarity with Palestine with Ambassador Hussam Zumlot, an anti-poverty event with Ian Byrne MP, disabled groups, left trade unionists, and a major Latin America solidarity reception. So grab your virtual ticket for the Solidarity Hub today, and that'll be as if by magic the links appear in the chat, and please also support the work of anti-war groups such as the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Stop the War, and CND, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you all on the next demonstrations and as part of the movement. So I'm going to move to our speakers and then we'll wrap up. So again, I'll take you in the order you spoke, giving you a bit of time to think about those final questions. Steve.
Okay, well, on the interesting point about would Starmer break with the US on the question of Israel, I think it's possible to a degree. Whilst we obviously have been emphasizing the degree to which Britain is subservient to the United States, and Starmer's strategy has been to cozy up to Trump and to try and keep that close relationship. And in a sense, he's been, of all the European leaders, I think the most servile towards Trump. Although it's a close thing with some of them. So I think but at the same time as that is the case, and I think that's the overarching thing, it has been the case that the different, the European imperialist countries, France, Germany, and Britain in particular, have taken different positions to the United States. And there's a degree of rivalry between capitalist countries, even within their alliance. France, for example, didn't support the invasion of Iraq. Britain historically has tended to be, and I think this is what troubles some people in the Tory party who are speaking out on the question of Palestine. Britain historically has had close ties with the Arab world and has been obviously the big colonial power in the Middle East. And so it has tended to take a more kind of, whereas the United States was for the creation of the State of Israel, Britain abstained. The United States has seen Israel, I think, from the outset as its vehicle in the Middle East, and to some extent its way of elbowing aside Britain and France, who were the predominant colonial powers. Now, Britain's position is so much weaker now than it was. We're not in a situation, our ruling class not in a situation it was, say, in the 1960s, where we declined to go along with the United States in Vietnam. But that said, it is still the case that there are distinctly British interests, and I think we're seeing, in terms of language at least, some difference now, and in terms of one or two small acts of punishment, if you like, against Israel. It's pathetic. It's far from what it should be, but I think the combination of mass pressure within Britain and the fact that Britain does have these slightly different interests to the United States in the Middle East could mean that there is a breakthrough, and obviously we have to. That's what we're all working towards. On the question of what can we do about all this? Well, I mean, obviously the central thing I was saying earlier is about opening up this debate about NATO, because I think there's a lot of disillusioned people who are leaving the Labour Party, and there's a possibility of a new party, and then there's the Greens, and some people might go to Plaid Cymru, some people might go to the SNP, I don't know, and there's other smaller groups. I don't see much point in all of that. If all those small, more leftish organisations end up being in some way or another pro-NATO. I mean, the leader of Plaid Cymru is sort of, he wants associate membership of NATO, he says. The Greens are pro-NATO. Hopefully, if this new party gets off the ground, it will be very clear on the question of NATO. So I think that's one important thing, that there needs to be more clarity on the left about where the problem is. And the problem is NATO. It wraps everything up in one bundle, as it were. The other thing that I think is a problem, and I think all of us who are members of trade unions should work on, is that we haven't made much headway in this period. There was headway made years ago, but we haven't made much headway in this period about the issue of arms spending creating jobs. Starmer is selling that very hard, and he's got a lot of the unions on side in that respect, even unions that consider themselves on the left, like Unite. We need to make, and they have members in the arms industry, who obviously their first job is to protect the jobs of their members. But those jobs can be protected by a transition to, they're not going to be, going down the road of rearmament and even more militarization. It's just is making those workers even more dependent on those government contracts and on, ultimately on war. It doesn't make any of us more secure. It doesn't make our jobs more secure. It doesn't make our lives more secure. And in any event, every pound you spend on arms, if that was spent on other things like developing renewable energy, like house building, like the NHS, it would actually create more jobs anyway. So we really need, I think, to work on that with this huge increase in arms spending that's Starmer is taking us, the path he's taking us down. We really need to step up our argument on how arms spending, if that money was spent on other things, it would create more jobs than arms spending creates.
Thank you, Steve. Extremely important points. I'm going to go next to Jenny for your concluding remarks and any observations on the last set of questions. Thank you.
Yes, I agree very much with what Steve is saying there. I think that, on this question of Starmer and the Labour government, let's not forget that it was under a Labour government that we joined NATO in the first place, and it was under a Labour government that we developed nuclear weapons. So these perspectives are very, very deep-rooted. But I do agree that now it's a high time that we had a debate about NATO, and somehow we've got to shatter this myth that NATO is an organisation for defence, which is how most people have seen it, and that's why they cling on to it. And so the discussion about NATO, as we've been talking about, is related to a discussion about common security, and the idea that no one can be safe until everyone is safe. You can't make yourself safe at the expense of someone else's security. This just doesn't work. That as part of that debate, we also have to be talking about how we should readjust our position in this increasingly multipolar world. And I will point out that apparently there was a report from the French Parliament recently, which was dealing precisely with these matters. It was calling for a global currency to work away from the dependence on the US dollar, and it was calling for a break with the United States, and it was calling for more cooperation with China. As I said before, I think this is a question of our priorities, that these have to be linked with how we make the green transition. this is becoming more and more important, and especially in the light of the fact that, Trump doesn't care about this at all. I think that on the question of jobs, this Starmer's idea that defence is the driver of growth simply doesn't hold water. And even the director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies has pointed out, and this actually Marga made this point, that merely stockpiling weapons won't drive growth. And she also goes on and says more jobs in one area mostly means fewer jobs elsewhere. So, these arguments can really penetrate widely. The spending that is being proposed is a colossal waste of money. It's just the most huge waste of money. I think back to about 20 years ago when it was decided, I think it was under Gordon Brown, that we should start being involved in the manufacture of F-35s, and we should build our own aircraft carriers. And the fact of the matter is that the aircraft carriers are only afloat half the time, and the F-35s are only in flight 55% of the time. This is a colossal waste of money. And if you think back 20 years, what was the decision that China made? It made the decision to go for renewable energy and EVs. And where are they now? So these are the kinds of things that we have to think about. I would recommend on what to do, I would recommend CND's Alternative Defence Review, which analyses Starmer's defence review and breaks it down and puts forward the argument for alternative jobs. And that is something that can be taken up in trade union branches. I won't say Labour Party branches. I think some Labour Party branches will, but my Labour Party branch hardly lets me speak. And I think that, that yes, we do have to have simple messages, but even no matter how hard working and how little time people have, I think it's that, the mistake of the Labour leadership is that it took people for granted and thinks that people are stupid, and they're not. A lot of people are talking about what's going on and why it's going on. And as something to do, I shall be out on the streets on Friday evening with a saucepan or a bowl, demonstrating to open the doors of Gaza to humanitarian aid.
Thank you for that final action point. That's something we can all do. And Marga, finish us off. You've just got a couple of minutes, I'm afraid, just to rally us all into action once more.
So let me go to bullet points. My three arguments against these military expenditures. First, is absolutely maths. If you got the 5% of the GDP to weapons, you got to take this 5% from the existing public investment. So it's a decrease of the quality of life we got. But, and also we need the money for creating good jobs, technology, basically, and also new industries in order to create some future. The second argument is that we made the research in Spain, and one tank is the same amount of money you need to create one school. So one tank, one school. This is the decision we need to make, and this is clear, and the amount of money is similar or the same. But the third argument, I think, is something we didn't talk yet in this conversation, is that if some wars happen, it's the son of the working class who goes to the field. It's not the son of the ruling classes. It's our people who go to put their bodies on behalf of this military industry. And we need to, particularly in the UK, remember the history of the working class in the war, because it's a living memory in the UK as in the rest of Europe, and this is very important. Let me finish with something that I found particularly positive. I think there is like a generational rift between the youngest generation and the oldest on the question of Palestine. When I see in the streets of Europe, young people going to the street to defend Palestine and against the genocide, I think there is like a generational rift in a positive way. So let me put my hope in this new generation who is not allowing for free to having a genocide in front of our eyes, with no maybe knowledge, maybe not big debates about history, but with the right moral position in order to defend what we need to defend, is that all human lives matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yes, there is hope in the younger generation. So thank you so much, everyone. Sorry it went on a bit longer than expected, but you asked a lot of questions and we wanted to get as many answers in as possible, and some very clear action points around NATO, some very clear arguments around military spending, and some very good discussion about the wider world. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks especially to our speakers, and solidarity.